pre-registered for Bible school. And so we're looking for a great turnout. Continue to pray for that. Continue that. I've been just praying that God would just overwhelm us with kids. And I know that Lindsay is really excited about that prayer, that there would just be chaos here because there's so many kids. And so just continue to pray for that. That's coming up. Also, you can see in the bulletin, the Sunday after Bible school, we're going to have our quarterly prayer and praise here at the church. So keep that in mind as well as we gather together for that. Also, kind of a more of a fun type thing. Well, not that those other things aren't fun, but out on the table, this is the last day to sign up. If you'd like to go to the Pittsburgh Pirates game, the sign-up sheet is out here. We are not getting a bus or anything like that. You'll get the discount, but you'll be responsible for getting there on your own, or we can carpool or something like that. That is out there today, last day to sign up for that. So today we are continuing our series, Following the Way. So we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Mark in the New Testament, just as we've been the last couple of weeks. And actually, next week we're going to finish up this series. In a couple of weeks, we're going to start a new series in the book of Jonah. Okay, it is going to be a whale of a sermon series. We're going to hear about some things that may sound a little fishy. And probably a lot of puns, okay? Terrible puns at that. But one of the things that we're going to discover in the book of Jonah is that the whole idea of the book of Jonah and Jonah's life, the main character in there is not Jonah. It's not the fish. It's not the storm. It's not even the Ninevites that Jonah went to. But what we're going to discover in that book of Jonah is that the main character, the main thrust is the relentless love of God that is present throughout that entire book. And so we're going to start that in a couple of weeks. So just want to let you know about that. But if you were to drive from San Francisco north, you would end up in Muir Woods. And the Muir Woods is where there is some of the largest trees on the face of the earth. They're the great sequoia trees there of the West Coast. And you've probably seen pictures of them. Maybe you've been there and you stood next to these massive trees that stand 250 feet high. And they estimate that some of these trees have been living for over 1,500 years. And so when you stand next to a tree that is 20 stories tall, that may have been around just a few decades after the fall of the Roman Empire, you realize how small you really are. And these trees are just massive and they're huge. And when you think about all the storms that these trees have survived and the winds that they have faced in the entirety of their existence, you would wonder, hey, how are they able to stand so tall and stay upright for so long? And as you think about that, you would say, well, they must have really, really deep roots into the earth. But what they've discovered is that these sequoia trees, though we would expect for them to have roots that go maybe tens of and maybe even hundreds of feet into the ground, they only go about 4 feet into the surface of the soil. Relatively shallow when you think about how tall these trees really are. But what they've discovered is that these sequoia trees remain standing not because their roots are deep, but because their roots are wide. And these sequoia trees, their roots actually intertwine with one another, and that is what keeps these trees standing upright. It's not really the depth of their roots, it's the fact that they are interdependent upon one another. And they would say that very seldom will you ever find a sequoia tree growing by itself. And that's what we're going to look at today. And we're going to understand today that we as Christians, that we are going to face storms and winds in this life. And one of the things that keeps us upright, the one thing that kind of keeps us moving, is the fact that we have roots that are rooted into one another. And the truth that we're going to see today from Jesus' life is just simply this, is that Jesus saw big things in small groups. Jesus understood that there are big things that happen when small groups of believers get together and they pray for one another and they encourage one another and they walk with one another and they bear one another's burdens. Big things happen in small groups. And we're going to look today in Jesus' life as we follow the way and look at some of these disciplines that Jesus had in his life. And we're going to see that Jesus had a small group. It was a small group of 12 men that he brought together, and he brought them together so that they could just simply do life together. They made mistakes together. They listened to Jesus together. They kind of debriefed one another around the campfires after Jesus got done teaching with one another. They really helped encourage one another. And I would say that many of these men that were in this original small group became the men that they became a lot because of the small group that they were in while Jesus walked here on the earth. And so this is the third message in our series, Following the Way, the simple patterns of Jesus. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at some of the things that Jesus incorporated in his life so that you and I can incorporate them into our lives, that we are actually, as believers, we're commanded to imitate and to be like Jesus. And so if Jesus did these things, then we should do these things as well. And we've talked about some of these things that Jesus has done. If you were here the first week, we talked about how the gospel was preeminent in Jesus' life, that the gospel's proclamation was Jesus' fixation, that he went everywhere so that every man, woman, boy, and girl could hear about the gospel of the kingdom of God. If you were here last week, we talked about how prayer was a priority in Jesus' life, that he didn't just have a prayer life, that he had a life of prayer. Jesus wasn't a guy who just prayed. He was a man of prayer. And we looked at how really over the entirety of his life here on earth, Jesus prayed and he prayed and he prayed and he prayed. And today we're going to see the importance of small groups in Jesus' life. Now, this entire series comes from our memory verse through the series. Now, I kind of gave you an easy one during this series, kind of short. It says, therefore, as you have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him. That you are to live and you're to act and you're to react, you're to think, you're to respond, just like Jesus would. And we're looking at these things that Jesus incorporated into his life. And so today we're actually going to be in Mark chapter 3. And we're going to look at how Jesus prioritized small groups in his life. Now, we left off last week in Mark chapter 1. And remember, Jesus was out early in the morning while it was still dark, and he was praying. The disciples found him, and they said, hey, what are you doing out here praying? Like, everyone's back in the city, and they're looking for you. And Jesus said to them, he said, guys, we're not going back there. We got other places to go. I have other places where I need to go so that I can preach the gospel. And so he went away. And I just want to read a few verses here to kind of set the scene for what we're about to talk about. But actually in Mark chapter 1, verse 49, it says this: he went out and began to proclaim it freely and spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in the unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere. Chapter 2, verse 1. When he had come back to Capernaum, several days afterward, it was heard that Jesus was at home, and many were gathered together so that there was no longer room, not even near the door, and he was speaking the word to them. In chapter 2, verse 13, and he went out again by the seashore, and all the people were coming to him, and he was teaching them. And you can see here, kind of setting the scene, what's happening is Jesus' popularity is exploding. Like, people are coming everywhere. He was the most popular person in his world, in the nation there. He was the most popular person. Everybody wanted to hear him. Everybody wanted to see him. Everybody wanted him to kind of intervene in their lives. If Jesus was having like concerts or selling tickets, every venue he would go to would be sold out almost immediately. He was extremely popular. But what we're going to discover here is that Jesus didn't really necessarily want to be popular. He wanted to be personal. And he realized that if he did not have a small group, that he would not have the personal interactions with the people that he desired. And so we're going to pick it up in chapter 3, beginning in verse 13. And the first thing that we see here is the priority of Jesus' small group. He really made this a priority in his life. Chapter 3, verse 13, it says this: and he went up on the mountain and summoned those whom he himself wanted, and they came to him. You see, this small group of believers that Jesus brought together, it wasn't like an accidental happening. Like, Jesus was intentional in bringing these individuals together. Now, I told you as we started the series that Mark was kind of like a man of action. You sit down, and if you read through the book of Mark in one sitting, you are exhausted afterwards. Not because it takes a long time to read it, but Mark just used this word immediately over and over again, that immediately this happened, immediately they went there. And it's just action after action after action. And so here in verse 13, Mark just simply explained what had happened. But if you look in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, Luke kind of gives a little bit more of a nuance as to what happened there. It said this in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 and 13. It was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles. You can see here that this small group that Jesus brought together was a priority in his life. He prayerfully and intentionally chose the individuals that were going to be in this small group. It wasn't just a group that happened by accident or coincidence. It was people that Jesus selected intentionally. And don't miss the word that Mark used here in verse 13. He went up on the mountain and summoned those whom he himself wanted. These were people that he wanted. Now, we know from earlier in Mark's gospel, we know from the book of Acts that there was a number of people who were followers of Jesus. Actually, in Acts chapter 1, it tells us that as they were meeting in the upper room and they were selecting an apostle to replace Judas after his betrayal, they said, hey, we need to select out of this group of 120 people somebody who was with Jesus the entire time. And that's how they selected. And earlier in Mark's gospel, he said there were many who were following him. So there may have been upwards of 100 people that were following Jesus. But Jesus understood this, that if he really wanted to make an impact, he wasn't going to be able to do it in a large crowd. He was going to have to intentionally select 12 of them that he would be able to have intentional, intimate conversations with. Men that he would be able to pull aside after he would do a large group teaching in order to expound it and help them make personal applications into their lives. You see, Jesus didn't want to be popular. He wanted to be personal with these guys. And for that reason, Jesus was intentional. And think about that. One thing that I've learned in my life is that community does not happen by accident. Community requires priority, right? A husband and a wife don't have a vibrant marriage relationship just because they sleep in the same bed. They have to be intentional. A family doesn't experience closeness just because they all live in the same house. It has to be intentional. A neighborhood doesn't experience the camaraderie that we expect just because we all live in the same locale. It's intentional. In the same way, even when it comes to the life of a believer in the church, we don't experience the community that Jesus intended the church to have unless we're intentional. Jesus was intentional in gathering these guys together. And the whole reason he did it, the whole reason this was a priority in his life, is because Jesus saw big things in small groups. And we go on here, we see the priority of Jesus' small group, but secondly, the purpose of Jesus' small group. Like, why did he do this? This group, this small group that he gathered together, was not intended to be a clique. It wasn't intended to be a faction. It wasn't intended to just simply be a club. He actually had a purpose in mind for gathering these 12 guys to live in community with him. Because he understood that he himself, as the perfect Son of God, would eventually need the imperfect love of these guys. Because there's two purposes for Jesus' small group. The first reason was that they would grow relationally. Look at what it says in verse 14. So after he chose those whom he himself wanted, and they came to him, verse 14, and he appointed 12 so that they would be with him. Mark just said he chose these 12, first of all, that they would be in the closest relationship with him, and by extension, that they would be in relationship to one another. This was intended to grow them, relationally in their relationships with one another. Because what Jesus did here was he brought them together, right? And he taught them. He taught them how to love one another. He taught them how to forgive one another. He taught them how to bear with one another. He taught them how to encourage one another. All of those one another's that we read throughout the entirety of the New Testament, Jesus brought these guys together so that he could teach them personally what it meant to one another. And Andy Stanley says this all the time. He said, when we just sit in rows, we cannot one another. It requires us to really be in small groups with other believers. So if you're only coming here on Sunday morning and this is the only time you see other believers in your life, you're not going to grow in this way in which Jesus intended believers to grow. When you experience the storms and the winds in life, you're not going to be able to stand because you're not going to have the roots that have grown in to other people's lives is going to help sustain you through the storms and the difficulties and the trials and the tribulations of life. Jesus' purpose for bringing believers together was that we would grow relationally in these one another's. But Mark went on, he said there was a second purpose in this, and that was to grow spiritually. Not just to grow relationally, but to grow spiritually. Verse 14 again, he appointed 12 so that they would be with him and that he could send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out the demons. Think about this. This group that he selected, we're going to look at them in just a minute here. This group that he selected, they were just normal, ordinary men. I mean, none of them were deep scholars. None of them had a background in oratory. None of them were what you would consider the kind of the cream of the crop. These were just ordinary guys that he brought together. And actually, if you look at the other side, these were guys who were prone to mistakes and misjudgments. They were prone to bitterness and jealousy and flying off the handle. I mean, you can read through the Gospels, and so many times Jesus basically looks at them and says, you guys are just spiritual blockheads, okay? You just don't get it. But he brought them together with him so that they could encourage and grow one another spiritually. Because Jesus understood that the preaching to the large crowds was not enough. It was only when he got alone with these guys and he kind of debriefed what he would tell in the large crowd that they finally actually got it. And so he would ask them questions. He would help them make the life applications so that in turn, so when the time came, he could send them out to preach the good news of the kingdom. Several years ago, I coached a 5th and 6th grade basketball team. I showed up at first practice and there were 30 kids in the gym that day. Okay. And the principal said, yeah, we just invite them all to come. Your job will be to come every Saturday and teach them the fundamentals. And so I taught them how to dribble a basketball. I taught them, how to good form in shooting the basketball and all of that. And as the season progressed, the principal came to me and he said, hey, I've entered the team into some tournaments, but you can't take all 30. So you're going to have to select 8 of them to take and play at all these different tournaments. And so when he told me that, I went up onto a mountain by myself, prayed all night, and selected those whom I wanted to be with me. And so I selected 8 of the boys out of the 30. And we would practice several nights a week to get ready for the tournaments. And I taught them things that I would have never been able to teach them in the large group. It wasn't that I didn't care about the other 22. It's just I didn't have time to teach all 30 of them the plays that we were going to run or how we're going to run the defense or what specific positions they're each going to play. I could only do that in a small group of 8. And Jesus saw the same thing. There was so much that he wanted to teach them and train them, but he would not be able to do that in a large group. And so he brought them together and he began to teach them and train them. And think about what happened here. He had Simon, who was so impulsive, who actually becomes Peter, the rock. You have average Andrew, who actually becomes the patron saint of 3 different nations. You have doubting Thomas, who becomes a relentless man of the faith. You have kind of Matthew, who nobody ever really liked, but he became a writer of the gospel of the Son of Man. And I don't discount them witnessing the resurrection. That had a huge, like one of the major transformations in their life. But I would say that this small group that Jesus, where he just poured into their life, had a large part in them becoming the men they ultimately became. Because Jesus saw big things in small groups. And then finally, we see here, Mark mentioned the people of Jesus' small group. As I read this list, we are 2,000 years removed, but it's a very strange list. It's a varied list. It's a very eclectic list, and hopefully I can draw some of those nuances out about these men that Jesus called to be with him. In verse 16, he appointed the 12, and Mark begins to list them. Simon, and to whom he gave the name Peter, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. To them he gave the name, whatever that is, which means sons of thunder. And Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, there's a couple things that I find fascinating as you read through that list. Number one is the diverseness of this list. I mean, when you read this list, you have guys who are on extreme polar opposites of the political spectrum. You have one who was a zealot, which meant that he wanted to throw off the Roman oppressors. Zealots were known in that day to kind of carry a dagger in their pocket, and if they would happen to come upon an unsuspecting Roman soldier, that it wasn't uncommon for them just to kill him, to murder him right there. On the other hand, you had Matthew, who was a tax collector, who actually worked for the Roman Empire, getting tax money from his own countrymen and giving it to their oppressors. And you have Jesus selecting both of these guys to be in a small group together. Can you imagine the tension that was there? Like if these guys had seen each other out on the street, it wouldn't have surprised anyone if they would have tried to kill one another. But yet Jesus brought them together. You have some guys who were disciples, who were followers of John the Baptizer before they followed Jesus. And then you have other guys who had no religious background at all. But yet Jesus brought them together. And when you think about this list, they were individuals who had different backgrounds, different personalities. They had different visions of the future. They had different passions. They had different desires. They had different things that they wanted to see Jesus do. But Jesus brought them together. And what held them together was the fact that Jesus was their common denominator. Jesus was the greatest common factor. And even though they had so many things different from one another, the thing that held them together was Jesus. Now listen, I have been in small groups with other believers who are not like me. I mean, imagine that. Man, how perfect would it be if everyone was like me? But anyways, they were like me. I mean, people that were not the same age as me, people who were different from me politically, people that were different from me socioeconomically, different than me culturally. I mean, I've actually been in small groups with people who actually love cats. But you know what? Even in those small groups, I have been loved and I have been able to love. Not because of what we don't have in common, but because of what we do have in common. And Jesus is greater than anything that we don't have in common. And so there's the diverseness of this group, but also the second thing that I notice in this list is the closeness of this group. Like they were really close, and we kind of miss this because when this list is given here in the Gospel of Mark, it's not a formal list. It's a very personal list. Now, I think I mentioned this, but the Gospel of Mark, of course, was written by Mark, but Mark wasn't a follower. He wasn't an apostle. He wasn't a disciple of Jesus early on. So Mark actually is writing down the recollections of Peter. And so Peter is sharing this story with Mark about Jesus, and Mark's writing it down and sharing the memories of Peter with all these people. And so Peter, he gets to this list, and it's amazing to me. Peter uses so many nicknames in this list. He said, hey, my name was Simon, but Jesus nicknamed me Peter. All right. And then you have James and John. And I remember Jesus nicknamed them the sons of thunder because, I mean, they wanted to call down fire and kill everybody one time. And so Jesus kind of gave them that nickname. You come to some of these other names and you come to the name Thaddeus. It's believed that Thaddeus was a nickname because it's a word that means big-hearted. And actually, in some of the other lists that we find in the other Gospels, Thaddeus' name is actually listed as Judas. And I love what John wrote in John 14:22. He said, Judas, not Iscariot. Okay, so we didn't want him to get confused with the other guy. And so as Peter is telling the story to Mark, he goes, yeah, I mean, he was Judas, he was not Iscariot, but he was so big-hearted. And we just called him Thaddeus. Like when you read this list, and it's not a formal list, you sense the closeness and the camaraderie that these guys had with one another. Even though they were so different, they had grown to love one another. And it really fulfilled that purpose that Jesus had, that they would grow relationally into one another, because Jesus knew this. He knew that the time with them was very short, 3 years. And after that 3 years, he was going to be gone. And he knew at that moment when he departed that these guys would need each other. They were not going to make it through life with all the persecution and the trials and the opposition that they were about to face if they did not have one another. Because Jesus saw big things in small groups. I'm sure you're asking yourself a question right now. Because all of that is true. What should you and I do? And I want to encourage you today to commit to being in a small group. Coming on Sunday is great, and don't stop coming on Sunday, but it's even greater when you commit to being involved in a small group with other believers. Now, this message today is kind of untimely because our small groups for this year are kind of winding down. There are some that's going to meet through the summer, but most of our small groups only go through the school year. And so we're going to actually kick these back off again in the fall. And so couple groups of people that I want to talk to here today as I kind of wrap this up and kind of give you some application here. If you are already involved in a small group, keep going to a small group, okay? But I want to encourage you, when next fall rolls around and I try to encourage people to get involved in a small group, I want you to look around on Sunday morning and just ask somebody, hey, are you involved in a small group? If not, hey, come sit with me. Come join my small group with me. Come sit with me in a small group. Also, I want to encourage you that if you're already involved in a small group, maybe taking that next step of being a small group facilitator. I use the word facilitator because I'm not asking you to be a leader, okay? I'm asking you to potentially be a facilitator. What we do here is sermon-based small groups. So in order to lead a group, all you have to be able to do, because we write out the questions for you, all you have to do is show up on Sunday, grab a paper as you're leaving, and just sit there and ask people questions right off the paper. That's all you have to do. Okay, it's really, really, really not that hard. Okay, now the hard part is you're going to ask a question, everybody's just going to sit there and look at you. Okay, And if you're having a small group at your house, what I always say is this: is hey, I live here, so I can stay here all night. Okay, and so that'll be the hardest part. But after you get to know each other, I mean, the conversation just kind of flows from there. So I want to encourage you to do that. If you're not in a small group, I want to encourage you. I cannot begin to describe how transformational small groups have been in my life. I want to encourage you to just to take that step and say, you know what, this fall, I'm going to get involved in a small group. One of the other things that we do here is D groups. I have booklets out here on the table that talk about that. That's a really, really small group, really designed for intentional discipleship. You don't really need to know a lot. Again, all you have to do is read the Bible with some friends and say, hey, what's God teaching you through all this? And it really is. And those, listen, I was just telling my group on Wednesday morning, just this week, because I've been going through some really difficult things personally. And I said to them, I said, I feel like I've hijacked this group because all you do is sit here and listen to me bloviate about all of my problems that I'm going through. But I will say this. I am so thankful for those men. I'm thankful for their prayers. I'm thankful for their advice. I'm thankful for their encouragement. And I don't know if I would have made it through the last few months now without their support. And so I am thankful for each and every one of them. You can have the same thing in your life if you would just commit to being involved in a small group. I don't know if you read, but earlier this month, the Surgeon General released a report. The report is entitled "The Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation in America." And the Surgeon General, Vice Admiral Murphy, said this in the report. He said that America is experiencing a social epidemic of loneliness. And I would say it's not just a social problem, it is a spiritual problem. Even in the report, he went on to say this. He said, because of the decrease in religious communities, there has actually been physical ramifications in people's lives. Like it's impacting us emotionally and relationally and physically because we're not in community with one another. And even the Surgeon General is able to see that. And so I want to encourage you, if you're not in a small group, get in a small group. I want you to imagine the lifetime of friendships you're going to make. Imagine how you're going to grow roots into other people's lives to encourage them and help carry them through. Imagine when your life kind of takes a wrong turn and how much they can help you through those things. Imagine how you're going to grow spiritually because you're just willing to be in a small group. Jesus saw big things in small groups, so I want you to commit to a small group because this is the way. Now, as I wrap up here, I'm going to ask Sarah Wolf to come. Sarah's been attending the church for just about a year now. And Sarah, early on, jumped into a small group. And so she's going to share with you some of those experiences that she had from small groups.
I don't know. That's really loud. I think if you can't hear me, Oh, okay. My husband and my two young kids and I, we come to the second service because they have the kids, all the stuff for all the kiddos. So we do that. But a couple of weeks ago, John called me and asked me if I wanted to talk about small groups. And I immediately said yes, not because I love public speaking. I do not. So bear with me. But because I love small groups. I didn't grow up in the church. We lost my dad when I was really young, and it was really hard on my mom. So I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up with some really faithful women, though. So I was really, really blessed to know Jesus even throughout all that. But because I didn't grow up in the church, I didn't grow up with a lot of the normal stories that you hear as a child, the famous Bible stories about Noah and Moses and all of this. I didn't know that growing up. So I went to college, which if anybody's been to college, it's a really testing time of your faith. And I was so blessed to be introduced to a small group, my very first small group. I call them my B-stud. They were our Bible study that we got together. And these girls are still in my heart. We still talk all the time. We still pray for each other. And these women didn't make me feel bad for not knowing about the Bible. They did not make me feel bad for not really understanding what, our 3-year-olds understand these days. And it really opened a thirst of knowledge for me. I'm an intellectual person. So knowing that I didn't know these things, I wanted to know these things. And these girls helped me and they prayed for me. They held me accountable and they encouraged me. And that was life-changing for me. That was fulfilling for my faith. So then I graduated college and I was like, what do I do now? I joined a church on State College because I went to Penn State, joined Calvary. And like Ashley was saying, we go every Sunday. And who do we know? I went every Sunday to that church. I loved the message. The sermon was amazing, but I didn't know anybody. We said good morning and that was it. I didn't meet anybody. I didn't feel connected to anybody. And I felt an absence, maybe a loneliness, as Ashley called it. I didn't really know what the point was. Eventually, I joined a women's Bible study. And again, that thirst for knowledge is what drove me. But what I didn't expect was the community. They were very different women from me. Some were much older than me, way different place in their life than me. But they loved me and I grew to love them. And it was really, really encouraging. And it was an experience I will never take for granted. So again, this just furthered my love of small groups. My husband and I moved to a new home. We started at a new church. The very first time we went there, we met this young couple just about our age, and they said, "Hey, you should join our small group." I didn't know who these people were. I didn't have a single clue. I was like, sure. Okay, let's give it a shot. So we went, and it was a group of 5 couples, all about our age, same phase of life. So not a lot of diversity there, but we grew really tight together, and we were close until we all had kids. And then everything kind of went by the wayside. And then again, just last year, my husband and I moved. We moved here to Tipton. We were looking for a new church. We tried a couple different churches. Weren't really for us. We came here and I heard Ashley speak, and that's the thing for me. I need a good pastor. I need an amazing sermon to move me. But again, we were coming here and we're like, if we don't know anybody, what's the point? I'm a huge introvert. I'm very happy to sit alone in my home, which when I have 2 young children doesn't happen very much. But it's really hard for me to reach out to people and get to know them. So knowing that this is the way God made me, and I have no shame for how I am, but that God intends for us to have community. I filled out that little card at the end of the summer that they always say, hey, if you're interested in joining a small group, fill this out. So I filled it out because, no offense, Ashley, I'm not going to go up to somebody and be like, hey, want to be in a small group with me? There's no way I'm going to do that. So I filled out the card, and a couple of weeks later, I got a text from John saying, hey, I hear you want to join a small group. What's your schedule like? Let's work with you. And they were so good to work with me. Like I said, I have little kiddos. Our schedule's kind of crazy. My husband and I both work full time. And John worked with us, and we found an amazing small group. I didn't know any of these people. I didn't have a clue who they were. But my husband and I were just talking as we were finishing up small groups a couple of weeks ago, how blessed we have been in the last 8-10 months that we've known this group. And that's not a long period of time, but I feel like my life and my trajectory has changed in knowing these people. The thing, if you want to get to love me, love my kids. These people have loved on my children so much that my little ones are so excited to go see them every week. And that's what drives me. They're happy to see the people they're loved on. I'm loved on. To be in this group where it is community, it is personal. They share their deepest heartaches with me, and they share their greatest joys. We can celebrate with one another and we pray for one another. And it is the best experience ever. And I really do encourage you, if you're not in a small group, to try to just write on that piece of paper, see where God fits you in, because I do believe that all of this is a God thing. This was not a coincidence. God put me and my family here for a reason and put me in this group. And I am so thankful for it.
Jesus saw big things in small groups. And thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Father, we thank you. We thank you for the people who have so influenced and impacted our lives. We thank you for the small groups of people, believers that you've brought into our lives to help sturdy us and strengthen us and help us to bear the burdens of this life. And so I do pray that as we leave here, that we would follow the way, that we would follow your example and be intentional about developing community with other believers. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.